Welcome to Silent Screams, where nightmares come to life. Get ready to step into a world of darkness, chilling whispers, and terrifying secrets waiting to be uncovered. Here, silence isn't peace, it's the prelude to your worst fears. Are you ready to face the depths of your darkest nightmares? Stay tuned for stories you'll never forget. Story 1, The Cursed Doll of Blackthorn Manor. The rain battered against the car windows as Lila navigated the winding road toward Blackthorn Manor. The air was thick with unease. She couldn't shake the sense that her winning bid at the estate auction had been a mistake. Among the relics of the late widow Edith Blackthorn, a peculiar porcelain doll had caught her eye. It was exquisite, its glassy blue eyes seemed almost alive, framed by golden curls. Despite warnings from other bidders about the doll's dark history, Lila felt compelled to buy it. An artifact like this will elevate my antique collection, she muttered to herself, clutching the doll tightly. Yet, the whispers at the auction replayed in her mind. The Blackthorn doll brings death. No one keeps it and lives. When Lila placed the doll in her study, she immediately felt the room grow colder. Dismissing it as her imagination, she turned off the light and went to bed. The storm outside howled as if warning her of what was to come. At precisely 3 a.m., Lila awoke to faint, rhythmic tapping. Tap. 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 She strained to hear the source, her heart pounding. Following the sound to the study, she found the doll had shifted. It now sat upright, its unblinking eyes staring directly at her. The tapping sound had stopped, but as she picked up the doll, its tiny porcelain hand felt unnervingly warm. Just an old artifact, she whispered shakily, returning it to its pedestal. But as she turned to leave, she heard a faint giggle echo in the darkness. The next morning, Lila researched the doll's history. Blackthorn Manor had a grim reputation. Edith Blackthorn's daughter, Clara, had mysteriously vanished at age 6. Town gossip claimed Clara's spirit became trapped within the doll. Subsequent owners of the doll had all met violent, inexplicable ends. Ignoring the mounting dread, Lila decided to consult a local historian, Mrs. Hargrove. The elderly woman's face paled when Lila mentioned the doll. "Burn it," Mrs. Hargrove urged. "That thing doesn't just haunt. It takes." "What does it take?" Lila pressed. "Your sanity first. Then your life." That night, armed with sage and salt, Lila tried to cleanse her home. Yet, as she encircled the doll in salt, it began to move jerky, unnatural motions that sent her scrambling backward. The giggle from before returned, now louder, more menacing. The lights flickered, and a shadow loomed on the wall, a child's figure, but distorted and grotesque. "You can't stop me," a voice hissed. "She is mine." Over the following days, Lila's life spiraled into chaos. Shadows danced where there was no light, and whispers called her name from empty rooms. Every time she tried to dispose of the doll, it reappeared, always in her line of sight. The hallucinations became worse. She saw a little girl in tattered clothes, her eyes void of life, standing at the foot of her bed. "Play with me," the girl would whisper, her voice hollow. Terrified, Lila sought out a paranormal investigator named Dr. Mallory Crane. Upon examining the doll, Dr. Crane looked grave. "This entity feeds on fear and attachment. It won't stop until it has consumed you entirely." Dr. Crane suggested a ritual to sever the spirit's link. It required Lila to confront the doll at the witching hour and resist its attempts to lure her into its game. At 3 a.m., Lila and Dr. Crane began the ritual. Candles flickered in a circle around the doll, and ancient chants filled the air. The doll's porcelain face cracked slightly, revealing a twisted, flesh-like texture beneath. "You can't have her," the entity roared, its voice reverberating through the house. Objects flew across the room, and the temperature dropped below freezing. Lila's vision blurred as the shadowy figure of Clara materialized. Her skeletal hand reached out, pulling Lila toward the doll. "I just want to play," Clara cried, her voice morphing into a guttural growl. Summoning all her strength, Lila screamed, "You're not real." The candles flared, and the doll erupted in flames. The room fell silent. The next morning, the doll's ashes were buried far from Blackthorn Manor. Lila felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Yet, as she drove home, her car radio crackled with static. Amidst the interference, a familiar giggle emerged. Playtime isn't over. Story 2, The Haunted Dolls. It was a dreary Sunday afternoon when Emma decided to visit the small, antique shop hidden at the end of the alley. The shop had been there for years, almost as if it had grown out of the surrounding buildings, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city. Her curiosity had always been piqued by the faded sign that read "Curiosities and Oddities." On the rare occasions she passed by, the window was often covered with dust, making it impossible to see the treasures that lay inside. This time, however, the door was slightly ajar. A strange pull drew her in. As she entered, the smell of old wood and musty cloth overwhelmed her senses. The air was thick with the weight of age and secrets. Emma's eyes scanned the dimly lit shop. The shelves were lined with all manner of things: worn-out books, tarnished silverware, and dusty clocks, but there was one collection that stood out among the rest. In the back corner, on a shelf that seemed to be deliberately ignored, sat a row of old dolls. They were not the kind of dolls one would find in a child's toy chest. Their glassy eyes stared out, unblinking, as if waiting for something. Their delicate porcelain faces were cracked in places, and their clothes were faded with time. But it wasn't the age that made Emma's heart race, it was the palpable sense of something wrong about them. Despite her reservations, Emma approached the shelf. Each doll seemed to whisper her name, not aloud, but in the silence between her heartbeats. She paused in front of one that looked particularly old. It was a little girl doll, no taller than a foot, with long, dark braids and a red velvet dress that was frayed at the edges. Her porcelain face was cracked, and the eyes, those cold, glass eyes, seemed to follow Emma wherever she moved. Emma's fingers hesitated as she reached out, almost instinctively, to touch the doll's face. The moment her skin made contact with the cool porcelain, a sharp chill ran down her spine. The doll's eyes shifted. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to make Emma freeze. She pulled her hand back quickly, her breath quickening. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with a kind yet unsettling smile, appeared behind her as if from nowhere. "Ah, I see you found Clara," she said, her voice raspy. "She's very special, to some people." Emma tried to muster a polite smile, though she was beginning to feel uneasy. "Special how?" The woman's smile grew wider, though her eyes darkened. "Some things are better left unexplained," she said cryptically. "But if you're interested in Clara, she's been waiting for someone." "Someone who's looking for answers?" Emma didn't know what to say. The woman's words hung in the air, thick with implication. Later that evening, as Emma lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was still in her mind. Her thoughts swirled with questions. Why did the woman call Clara special? And why had she felt the strange sensation that the doll was alive? Unable to sleep, she decided to return to the shop the next day. She had to know more. But as she approached the alley, a sudden dread gripped her. The shop was no longer where she had left it. The entrance was sealed, the windows now covered by thick, black curtains. It was as though the shop had never existed. Frantically, Emma searched the alley, but the building was gone, replaced by a crumbling wall. A chill settled deep inside her, an icy tendril wrapping around her chest. She felt as if something was watching her from the shadows. Days passed, and Emma couldn't escape the lingering sense of unease. She had to get Clara. It was as if the doll's presence had burrowed deep into her mind, pulling her toward an unknown fate. One evening, As she rummaged through a box of old family heirlooms in her attic, she found something strange, a worn, yellowed letter that had been sealed with wax. It had no return address, only her name written in an elegant, yet unfamiliar handwriting. With trembling hands, she opened it. The letter was short, but it sent a chill through her body as she read the words. Clara is not what she seems. She is not merely a doll, but the vessel for something far older. If you have come to claim her, then be prepared to face what you have awakened. It is too late now. She is coming. A sudden creak from below startled her. She wasn't alone. Slowly, Emma turned, her heart hammering in her chest. There, standing at the bottom of the stairs, was Clara. From that night forward, strange things began happening. Every time Emma turned around, Clara seemed to be in a different place. Her once innocent stare became more menacing, her cracked face twisted in ways that made Emma question her own sanity. The doll's movements, though subtle, were undeniable. It wasn't just Clara who haunted her now. The entire house seemed to change. The air grew thick with a presence that Emma couldn't see but could always feel. Whispered voices filled the silence of the night, and shadows danced in the corners of her vision. Her dreams became nightmares, each one more vivid than the last, always ending with Clara standing at the foot of her bed, eyes gleaming with malice. Emma sought out answers, visiting local historians and occult experts, desperate to uncover the truth. It was then that she learned the horrifying history of the doll. Clara was a relic of an ancient, forbidden ritual. The doll had once belonged to a wealthy family who had dabbled in dark magic. The child, their daughter, had died under mysterious circumstances, and it was said that the parents had trapped her spirit inside the doll in a desperate attempt to resurrect her. But they had failed. Instead, they had created a vessel for something far darker. Clara was no longer the spirit of a child, but something far more malevolent, a demon that fed on fear, that manipulated its victims, and ultimately, consumed them. On the night of the blood moon, Emma realized the truth. Clara had been waiting for her. She had chosen Emma as her next victim, and now, there was no escape. The walls of Emma's home seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer and the whispers louder. In a final act of desperation, Emma tried to destroy the doll. But when she attempted to burn it, the fire refused to touch it. She tried shattering it with a hammer, but the porcelain was unbreakable. Clara's laugh echoed through the house, cold and mocking, as Emma felt herself being drawn into the doll's twisted grip. And then, as if in answer to her desperate cries, the door to the attic creaked open. Clara, with her haunting eyes and twisted smile, was standing there, waiting. But Emma wasn't looking at the doll anymore. She was looking at something behind it, something much worse, something that had been released when the doll was awakened. With a final scream, Emma was swallowed by the darkness, her voice lost to the house, and the doll's eyes gleamed once more with unholy triumph. Story 3, The Doll That Watched. It was a stormy night when Evelyn bought the doll. The shop was tucked away in a dark corner of an old alley, almost hidden from the bustling streets of the city. She'd wandered through the rainy weather, searching for something new, something that would fill the empty space she'd felt since the death of her grandmother. She had always admired the strange and eerie objects, so when the dusty old shop caught her eye, she stepped inside without hesitation. The doll sat there on a shelf at the far end of the shop. Its glassy eyes, a dull shade of brown, seemed to gleam as though aware of her presence. It was unlike any other doll she had seen. Its porcelain face was cracked in places, its hair tangled and falling in unruly strands. Its clothing was old-fashioned, a faded lace dress that looked like it belonged to another time. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with a frail voice, had warned her. That doll, it watches. It remembers. But Evelyn, desperate for anything to fill the void, smiled and paid without a second thought. How much? She asked, reaching into her purse. As Evelyn placed the doll on the shelf in her bedroom that night, she felt an odd sense of unease. It was just a doll, she told herself, nothing more. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that its eyes followed her every movement. The following days were filled with strange occurrences. At night, she would hear faint whispers just soft enough to be dismissed as the wind or her imagination. But when she woke, the doll was always in a slightly different position. Its head turned a little to the left, or its hands were raised as if to greet her. At first, she thought it was a result of her own clumsiness, or perhaps a trick of the light. But when she returned home one evening to find the doll sitting on the edge of her bed, staring directly at her with its unsettling eyes, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. It hadn't been there before. Evelyn couldn't ignore it any longer. The whispers were getting louder, and the doll's movements were more pronounced. It seemed to come alive at night, shifting and tilting in ways that were impossible for a mere inanimate object. One night, after hearing the whispers again, Evelyn decided to confront the doll. She sat down in front of it, her heart pounding as she stared into its unblinking eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered, half mockingly, half afraid. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, as if in response, the doll's lips parted. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as a faint, rasping voice came from the doll's tiny, cracked mouth. "She's not gone. She's still here. Still watching." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream that rose in her throat. The voice, it sounded like her grandmother's. The next day, she rushed back to the shop. The elderly woman was still there, sitting behind the counter with an unreadable expression. "You heard it, didn't you?" the woman asked, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. Evelyn nodded, too terrified to speak. The woman sighed. "The doll is cursed. It's bound to this house, and to you now. There are stories of families who kept the doll. All of them went mad or disappeared. No one who has owned it has ever been safe. But, why? Why did I hear my grandmother?" Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. The woman hesitated before speaking. "The doll holds memories. It collects the souls of those who are lost. Once it has chosen you, it will not let go." Things grew worse after that night. The whispers in the house became louder and clearer. Evelyn would hear her grandmother's voice, calling to her in soft, soothing tones. It began as simple words, but then the messages grew more cryptic. "Don't let it in," her grandmother's voice warned one night. "It will take more." The doll's movements were no longer subtle. It would appear in places where Evelyn was sure she hadn't left it on her bed, at the foot of the stairs, even standing by the door as if waiting for her to return. Each time she looked into its eyes, the doll seemed more alive, more present. One evening, as she sat at her desk writing in her journal, the doll appeared in the doorway. Evelyn spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. It was impossible for it to have gotten there on its own. The doll's head tilted to the side, its eyes fixed on her, and Evelyn felt a cold chill wash over her. Suddenly, the lights flickered and the room grew colder. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping with one another. "Leave, now, before it's too late." Evelyn's hand shook as she reached for the doll. But as soon as her fingers touched the cold porcelain, a flash of intense pain shot through her body. She cried out, her knees buckling beneath her. A vision erupted in her mind. A shadowy figure, twisted and faceless, lurked in the darkness of her grandmother's old house. She saw the doll, just as it had been when her grandmother had owned it, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The figure reached toward it, its long fingers curling around the doll's tiny hands. And then it smiled. Evelyn's sleep became a battlefield, filled with terrifying dreams of her grandmother's house, the dark figure, and the doll. Each night, the figure came closer, its presence suffocating. In a desperate bid to free herself from the doll's hold, Evelyn did some research. She learned that the doll was not just haunted, it was a vessel for a malevolent spirit, a spirit that had once claimed the lives of those who owned it. The doll was its anchor, and now that Evelyn had taken it in, the spirit would claim her soul too. The only way to break the curse was to destroy the doll. But no one who had ever tried had survived. Evelyn took the doll to the fireplace, determined to end it once and for all. She held it in her hands, ready to throw it into the flames. But as the fire crackled, the doll's eyes gleamed, its cracked face twisting into a grotesque smile. Suddenly, the room grew silent. The whispers stopped. And then, from behind her, came the cold, familiar voice. Evelyn. She spun around, but no one was there. The fire roared to life, swallowing the doll whole. The house was quiet again. The whispers stopped. But Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. The doll, destroyed by the fire, had left its mark on her, its presence lingering, waiting for the next person to take it in. And though the doll was gone, Evelyn knew the truth: some spirits, once awakened, could never be truly vanquished. They would always watch. Always wait.